16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And this is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Have you ever felt like you've been trying to play tug of war with God? Yes. Thank you, the amen corner over there. Well, for those of you who don't know how tug of war is played, you have one rope, two or more players on either side of a central point. Sometimes the truly adventurous, like people in my family, decide to play it over a muddy hole. So the losers have to endure the shame of getting dirty. Tug of war can be really messy if you lose. So why is it that we try to play it with God in our lives? I mean, one moment you're getting it really, really right, being a good Christian, getting along with everyone, holding your tongue when you should, Anthony. And speaking up when it is right to do so. But the next moment, you are spectacularly failing. You're showing your bias. You're snapping back at your spouse. Oops, sorry, honey. You're impatient with the kids. Or you're sitting idly by when you're overhearing someone telling a racist or a sexist joke. How can we be so right one moment and so very, very wrong the next? Just ask Peter. Peter, the disciple who one day is getting the final Jeopardy question absolutely right when he proclaims Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Peter, this faithful disciple, who soon afterwards is trying to persuade Jesus to set aside his determination to save humanity with the words, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." You know, I wonder if God is up there shaking God's head at us at times and muttering, "Kids say the darndest things." Because Peter and really all of us just can't find a way to be consistent in our faithfulness. And then I think of my kittens. Now, as those of you who have known me for a while know well, I'm pretty crazy about cats, so bear with me, it's a cat story. And I'm especially crazy about my kittens. I've never owned two of them together before. And so at first, I was kind of horrified at the way that they would chase each other, pounce on each other, and then wrap their murderous mouths around each other's throats in what looks like a death to the duel. And then moments later, they are contentedly grooming each other, licking the impossible-to-reach areas on each other's furry little bodies, like their ears. Their ears, ew. I mean, you really have to love somebody to be willing to do that, I think. And the lesson that I've learned from them is that in our discourse with each other, and indeed in our relationship with God and each other, sometimes we're grooming each other in love, so to speak, and other times we're trying to tear each other's heads off. Acclaiming Jesus and then trying to derail him. Indeed, we kids do say and do the darndest things. It's like we're in a tug-of-war match with God, yes, and even with each other. But perhaps the biggest tug-of-war match that we're really in is with ourselves. Because if you're like me, you feel yourself battling yourself, trying to choose the good, but all too often getting it wrong. Now, I generally make it a rule to never bring into a sermon a text that hasn't been read. That was kind of hammered into us in seminary. But I'm going to make an exception here. Because this tug of war is so exactly like what Paul said in Romans 7. Understanding human nature exquisitely as he did, he confessed in verse 19, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." We are our own worst enemies, wanting so badly to do things right, but all too often giving into our baser nature and messing things up royally. Now, it's not as if we don't get any encouragement from God to make the right choices. After Peter proclaims Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God, Jesus gives him a new name, Peter, which, as we know, means rock. Not pebble or stone, mind you, rock. Something big and solid, like Peter's faith apparently was when he made that proclamation. Simon's faith was, according to Jesus, like a massive rock, something durable that Jesus could use to build his church on. And this is something that Adam Hamilton points out in the book that we've been studying that I think is worth mentioning here. Jesus says that he is the one building his church. Did you catch that? Peter isn't doing it. The other disciples aren't doing it. It's Jesus, using the faith that God gave Peter and the others, Jesus, who gets the job done. And I think that this is important to remember because of what happens with Peter, this rock of faith, so soon after his famous proclamation. You see, Jesus knows full well that Peter, despite his faithful words, still does not understand the scope of Jesus' mission. When Jesus later explains what the Messiah will have to suffer in order to bring wholeness to humanity, Peter tries to talk him out of it. And Jesus rebukes him in the sharpest possible terms, calling him Satan or accuser. Jesus knew that Peter's faithfulness was incomplete, despite his getting it right once. So Jesus said that the task of building his church would be his own to accomplish, because Jesus is the only one completely faithful enough to do it. Which can bring all of us down a peg or two, especially those of us who consider ourselves faithful most of the time. The job of establishing the reign of God on earth is just too big and important to entrust it entirely to the hands of often flawed disciples like Peter and the rest of us. So Jesus says, and I paraphrase him, "I know you're trying your best, and sometimes you really deserve applause. But the fact that you are still a trainee means that I'm going to have to take hold of the ropes and even drag you where you need to be sometimes, discipleship-wise." I don't know about you, but even though I feel bad about my own flaws, I take comfort in the fact that this Jesus movement thing isn't all up to me. Jesus can and does use me when I yield myself to being his disciple, but I and the rest of us are not the ones in charge here. Thank God for that. You see, and this is the real point that I'm trying to get to here. Jesus is so amazing that he actually chooses to entrust the growth and leadership of his church to people who are bumblers like Peter, like you and like me. And I think that's because he knows that ultimately we do want to get it right. We do want to be more faithful and less flawed. So why is it so hard for us to do that? Well, in Peter's case, I think his love for Jesus was incomplete and blinded him to what Jesus' mission was really all about. I think he thought Jesus would be the conquering hero who would release the Jewish people from Roman oppression. And he loved Jesus so much that the idea of Jesus having to suffer and die, well, that was just unthinkable. It was unthinkable because his love was misguided. It was based on the idea of a strong hero God who would restore things to the way that they should be. Maybe he was more in love with his idea of who Jesus should be than he was with the actual Jesus who was telling him that suffering was coming and was necessary. That one hits a little closer to home for me. And probably for a lot of us. Because let's be brutally honest here. Wouldn't we rather have that warm, fuzzy Jesus? The buddy who loves us the way we are and just wraps his arms around us all the time, keeping us safe? But what about the Jesus who tells us the truth about life? That it involves suffering and sacrifice. And yes, it can get messy and even bloody. The Jesus who insists that we cannot stay comfortable, but instead calls us to take up our own crosses to follow him. Who wants that Jesus? But still he calls. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. This different idea of Jesus is what confronted Peter that day when Jesus called him Satan. Peter wanted to entrust his life into the hands of the conquering Messiah, the Son of the living God, who would crush his enemies and make life, well, all warm and fuzzy. But Jesus had heard that line before. When Satan the accuser tempted him in the wilderness, Jesus knew it was oh so easy to give in to that temptation, to claim power at the cost of giving over ultimate authority to what would not be life-giving. He rejected it in the wilderness, and he rejected it again when Peter offered it to him. So those of us who would follow Jesus are confronted with the same tug of war that Peter was. Are we going to rest on our laurels of occasionally getting it right? Or are we going to allow our faith to be challenged, tested, and risked for the sake of a world that is crying out in pain? Are we going to be willing to step out of our own comfort zones, pick up a cross, and stumble along with Jesus as he makes his painful way toward Calvary? Because if not, we're going to find that this tug-of-war match that we've been playing all of our lives is going to leave us falling into a mud pit of disillusion and an unsatisfying life. So perhaps the best we can do this Lent is just let go of the ropes entirely. To acknowledge that as humans who call ourselves Christians, we are simultaneously saints and sinners. Thank you, Martin Luther. Faithful and flawed. Sometimes getting it right, and sometimes getting it really, really wrong. If we let go of the rope and can make that honest assessment of ourselves, we can allow Jesus to pick us up and carry us over that mud pit. We can confess that we need help with being faithful and that suffering scares us. And that's when Jesus can really use us, warts and all, to build his reign on earth. Amen. Our hymn of the day is hymn 592, Just as I Am. Please stand as we sing together.